When it comes to competitive Pokemon, I feel like when anything shows any kind of signs of, dropping in viability or being bad, people tend to be a little bit harsh. Like, oh, you're telling me this thing dropped 2 whole tiers? Well, I guess it's complete garbage. Oh. Or something like, oh, you're telling me this Pokemon is generally less effective than this very similar Pokemon? Oh, well, I guess it doesn't have any niche whatsoever then. Ah. Right. When it comes to people less familiar with competitive Pokemon, I think a lot of people just, tend to take things at face value or just believe something they hear enough without really thinking about it. For example, in my Generation 1 type tier list video, I put the notoriously overpowered Psychic type as second best in the game, and I put Normal as the best type in the game. And I got a ton of comments from people saying stuff like, wow, I never really thought about it, I just kind of assumed Psychic was the best because that's what people talk about. And yeah, Psychic has the reputation of being notoriously overpowered, and you don't really hear it for normal types. And while I think it's not quite to the same degree, I think the Bug type in Generation 1 is also a bit of a victim of this. I honestly don't think there's a single type in Pokemon history with as bad of a reputation as Bug types in Generation 1. And listen, hot take of the fucking century here, the Bug type in Generation 1 is actually great. On paper. See, unlike some genuinely awful types like Poison, which despite there being some good Poison type Pokemon, is just a complete detriment. It has nothing going for it. Or the Fighting type, which has no defensive utility at all and just crumples to the type it was designed to counter, Bug is actually fundamentally sound. It's got 4 very manageable weaknesses. And yes, 4. In Gen 1, Bug is weak to Poison, and Poison is weak to Bug. I don't know how the fuck that happened. It's weird. It definitely works out better for the Bug type than it does for the Poison type, but yeah, it's weird. Funnily enough, I was actually wrong about this in my Gen 1 type tier list. I said that Bug had 3 weaknesses, when in reality, it's just got 3 weaknesses that actually sort of kind of matter, and then the Poison weakness. The weaknesses aren't bad. Fire, Flying, and Rock, that's very manageable. Not only was I wrong, but no one even corrected me in the comments, so I was wrong about it on the internet and I didn't hear about it, so if that doesn't tell you that the Poison type weakness just doesn't matter, then I don't fucking know what will. And on top of having manageable weaknesses, it's actually got some nice resistances. The Fighting type resistance is air, the Grass type resistance is okay, but the Ground type resistance is actually a great trait to have, and gives you a lot of good switching opportunities. The Bug type, on paper, pretty good. But unfortunately, it's a bit of a victim of circumstance, because, like I said, it's good on paper, but someone at Game Freak took that paper and was just kinda, Yeah, they weren't very nice to the Bug type. So yeah, you probably heard about some of this, but the Bug type was not dealt a very good hand in Generation 1. There are only 3 Bug type moves, one of which is complete garbage, and the other 2, which are like nearly okay, are only learned by 1 of the 6 fully evolved Bug Pokemon. On top of that, Bug is the only type in the game that's super effective against Psychic. So the fact that these, only okay moves have pretty poor distribution really hurts. And it's not just the moves that are weak, unfortunately. A lot of fully evolved Bug-type Pokemon have really, really low base stat totals, and they have other issues that make them weak, such as poor coverage and such. However, despite the fact that every single fully evolved Bug-type Pokemon is never used, some of them can make things happen sometimes, and I don't think the type is what drags these Pokemon down a lot of the time. Again, I'm going to refer to my Gen 1 type tier list. While there are some things I'd change, for example, I think Water is probably A tier, and Rock and Ground are probably B tier in hindsight. I think I was probably just thinking too much of Rhydon and Golem when I put them in A tier. There honestly isn't a single thing I'd change about D or C tier, and C tier is where I have Bug, as only the 4th worst type in the game. I don't think the Bug type is anything that great, but it's not garbage, which is what a lot of people think it is. So, that's what I want to talk about today. We're going to go through all the fully evolved bug Pokemon, talk about how they work, if the bug type is the problem with those Pokemon, and if there are any that can have any kind of an impact in Overused. Also, unlike the fighting type video, we're going to go from worst to best with these Pokemon. I started off with the best fighting type and ended on the worst in the fighting type video, but for this, I want to end on a good note, because I really like the best bug type. Now, if we're doing this from worst to best, that unfortunately means I have to start with Beedrill, and that kinda hurts to say. I like Beedrill. I think Beedrill's neat, I appreciate them, but unfortunately, they are complete garbage. Beedrill is the only Pokemon out of these 6 that, as far as I can tell, has no niche anywhere. Now, that might seem strange to say, considering all 6 of these Pokemon are in Never Used, and some of them don't actually have a niche in Never Used, but here's the thing. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but there's sort of a Smogon alternative called Pokemon Perfect, and at least for Generation 1, they've a bit of a different tiering system. See, Smogon has Overused and Underused, and Pokemon Perfect replicates that with 1U and 2U. Those are pretty much identical to Overused and Underused respectively. However, after Underused, Smogon just has Never Used, but after 2U, Pokemon Perfect has 3U all the way down to 6U, which is the equivalent to modern day ZU, or Zero Used. I think this is really neat because it's kind of cool to see Pokemon that just have nothing to do in Never Used be like actual meta threats in these like small little metas. I don't know, even though I don't think they're played very much, I think it's cool to see, but unfortunately, even all the way down in 6U, Beedrill's got nothing. It has absolutely no kind of niche whatsoever, and that's kind of sad. Beedrill just kind of has everything working against it. It has horrendous stats. It has 2 stats that are higher than 70, a speed stat of 75 and an attack stat of 80, neither of which are anything special. In later generations, it's got a special defense stat of 80, but this is back when special was 1 stat, and wouldn't you know it, that is shit for Beedrill. It's also part poison typing, so remember how I mentioned that Bug's ground resistance is quite nice? Nope, not for Beedrill, no resistance here. Also, that poison type makes it weak to Psychic, which even in a tier where the power level is so low that there are actually no Psychic types, a Psychic weakness is still a problem. And yeah, Drowsy, the weakest Psychic type in Generation 1, is a top tier Pokemon in 5U. The second lowest tier. Ouch. That says a lot about the power level in 6U. One thing that's really sad about Beedrill being as bad as it is that it's actually got one trait that a lot of bug types would really appreciate. I mentioned earlier that there are 2 sort of good, kind of nearly okay bug moves. Twin Missile, a 25 base power move that hits twice, and Pin Missile, a 14 base power move that hits 2 to 5 times. These are both moves that exist. They're nothing amazing, but they're all the bug type has. Or they would be if Beedrill wasn't the only fully evolved bug type that could learn these moves. Yeah. In fact, it's actually the only Pokemon in the entire game that learns Twin Needle, and the only Pokemon in the whole game that learns Pin Missile aside from Jolteon. So yeah, this potentially pretty good trait is stuck on one of the worst fully evolved Pokemon ever made. Beedrill can try to do like a double dance set with Swords Dance and Agility and then Twin Needle and Hyper Beam, but it's not doing anything that other Pokemon aren't just miles better at. You could maybe put Toxic on it. Toxic sucks in Gen 1, but at least you're statusing something which would have more impact over the course of a game than Beedrill. Now, the 5th worst bug type in Generation 1 is a little bit up in the air. If you're going off Pokemon Perfect's tiering system, then they actually have the Pokemon I have ranked at 5th worst higher than the Pokemon I have ranked at 4th worst, but I think Pokemon Perfect is probably a little bit outdated. I'm going to stick with Smogon on this one, and if we're going off Smogon, this is another Pokemon with no niche in NU, while the number 4 pick does have some kind of tiny niche. Parasect has a few things going for it over Beedrill. For a start, it's got a stat higher than 90. Fucking man, and that's something. It's also got 5 resistances, 4 of which are actually really nice. There's a lot of use that you can get out of them, and Parasect's bulk isn't dreadful, so it can potentially use these pretty nicely. On top of that, in the same vein as Beedrill, Parasect has one very unique trait that no other Pokemon has, and admittedly, a lot of Pokemon would actually really appreciate. Parasect is the only fully evolved Pokemon in Generation 1 with access to Spore, the only 100% accurate sleep move in the entire game. This is an amazing trait, and you'd think it'd give Parasect some kind of a niche somewhere, considering that Sleep is potentially the strongest it's ever been in Generation 1. You're asleep for 1 to 7 turns, and you can't move the turn you wake up. Unfortunately, there's a lot wrong with Parasect. It's incredibly slow, being tied with Snorlax and Slowbro at a miserable 30 base speed. This means that if it wants to switch in and use Spore, it's probably going to have to eat 2 attacks, and while its bulk isn't awful, it's not that good either, so you'd really rather it didn't. Now in fairness, once it has put something to sleep with Spore, it has access to Stun Spore to spread paralysis, but Parasect's utility outside of Spore is very limited. It has a decent 95 attack stat and a decent 80 special, but very limited options to actually use that with. Its best stab options are the miserable 20 base power Leech Life and Mega Drain, which is only 40 base power. Parasect's Leech Life is only a 4-hit KO on Exeggutor, a Pokemon with a quadruple weakness to Bug. Also, while Parasect does have 5 resistances, it's got 6 weaknesses, and Paras and Parasect are the only 2 Pokemon in Pokemon history to have 3 4x weaknesses. In future generations, they've only got 2, and this is because in Generation 1, like I said, Bug is weak to Poison, so Paras and Parasect have a 4x Poison weakness. Now, I did say that Poison is a terrible type in Generation 1, and that's true, but if you're using Parasect, you're probably using it in Never Used, and in fairness, you might actually run into Poison-type attacks in Never Used, so it can potentially come up. Parasect is basically a one-trick pony, but it's a very, very sick one-trick pony that will either die before it can do its one trick, or be put down immediately after. Just like Beedrill, it has no niche in Never Used. We're finally getting into the Pokemon that have an actual niche in Never Used now, although admittedly, this Pokemon's niche is very, very small. Butterfree is up next, and Butterfree is a Pokemon that exists. It's got slightly better stats than Beedrill, and I would argue a much better typing in Bug Flying, and on top of that, it's got one quite nice unique trait, which lets it stand out in Never Used. Butterfree is the only Pokemon in all of Generation 1 with a ground immunity and access to both Sleep Powder and Stun Spore. This doesn't give it a massive niche, it's got a lot of competition from Pokemon like Venomoth and Execute, but it's something. It can switch in on something like Golem's Earthquake, put it to sleep, and then try and paralyze whatever comes in next. Butterfree's biggest issue is that its utility outside of this is very, very limited. It's not strong at all. It has no Bug or Flying type attacks, although they wouldn't really do much coming off its 50 base attack. Pretty much all it can do offensively is throw out pretty meager Psychics, try and hit stuff that resists Psychic with a very meager Hyper Beam, or just throw Caution to the Wind and go for Psywave. None of these are that great, but unfortunately they're all Butterfree really has going for it after it's put something to sleep. Butterfree is not a great Pokemon, even in Never Used, but it's doing something that no other Pokemon can do, so that's worth something. Also, back to Pokemon Perfect again, something I find very interesting about Butterfree is that it's a top tier Pokemon in 6U, the lowest tier, alongside Kabutops and Machamp. Yeah, it's kind of fucked up to see Machamp all the way down here. And funnily enough, Butterfree is actually one of the best answers to Machamp, because Butterfree has the strongest Psychic in 6U. I don't know what the fuck is going on down in that tier. That's some wacky shit, but I don't know. I thought it was cool. We're in the upper half now, and we're moving on to the third best Bug type in Generation 1. And we're breaking new ground here, because this is the first one that has a UU analysis written for it, which is pretty neat. Unfortunately, that analysis is pretty much just, hey, you might think this is good enough to use in Underused. It's not, but we appreciate the effort. Anyways, we're moving on to Scyther, and Scyther is maybe the most unfortunate bug type. On paper, Scyther looks quite good. It's got a decent typing that gives it a ground immunity, it's got pretty nice stats, and it can make those stats even better because it has access to agility and sword stance. So, where does it all go wrong for Scyther? The move pool. This is, on God, maybe the saddest move pool in all of Generation 1. In Pokemon Red and Blue, Scyther only learns normal type attacks and nothing else. And then in Pokemon Yellow, they felt like throwing it a bone, and they gave it Wing Attack, which in Generation 1 is 35 base power. So, that kinda doesn't do shit. Scyther may be a bug type, but it sure as fuck doesn't feel like one. Because of its absolutely abysmal move pool, all it can really do is hit you with decently powerful non-stab normal attacks, and that's okay. Like, normal type attacks are good, but you need a little more than that, especially if they're not stab. If Scyther faces a rock type, it's probably dead, and if it's facing a ghost type, it can't even hit it outside of the terrible wing attack. At the very least, it does have access to Slash, which is quite nice, because in Generation 1, if you're fast enough, it'll always crit. However, this is kind of at odds with the only other thing that Scyther can do, which is being a Swords Dancer. If you boost your attack, crits ignore the boosted attack stat. Scyther is not the worst Pokemon out there. It does one thing, and it does it okay. Not okay enough to have any kind of niche in higher tiers, but it kind of does stuff nearly sometimes. Moving on to the second best bug type in Generation 1, and the best without a niche and overused, we've got Venomoth. Venomoth is not the most interesting mon in the world, it's basically just an overall better Butterfree, although Butterfree again does have a few things going for it, namely the ground immunity. Being bug poison isn't ideal, of course you're neutral to ground and you've got a psychic weakness, but in never used it does have some amount of utility. Toxic is actually pretty common in never used, usually in combination with a trapping move like Wrap, and being immune to that is actually quite nice. It's pretty much the only defensive use you're ever going to get out of the poison type. I think the biggest thing that sets Venomoth apart from Butterfree is its speed tier. Venomoth has base 90 speed instead of Butterfree's 70, which is really nice. You outspeed a lot of dangerous threats in the metagame, and you tie the best Pokemon in the tier, Mr. Mime. Now, if you're trying to win that speed tie and land a Sleep Powder, that's a risk even I wouldn't go for. You know, you've got to win the 50-50 and then you have the 25% chance of missing Sleep Powder. And if, like, anything goes wrong there, you just eat a Psychic and die. But, you know, if you want to go for that, more power to you. Even after it's put something to sleep, it's got some mid-game utility thanks to Stun Spore, and while it's not that strong, it's only got Psychic and Mega Drain for attacking, it is a little bit stronger than Butterfree, which had base 80 special while Venomoth has base 90. It's nothing much, but it's something to do after you've put something to sleep. Venomoth is a genuine threat in the never used tier. It also has some value in underused, as the fastest user of Sleep Powder in the tier. It's not the fastest sleeper, that goes to Haunter with base 95 speed, but Haunter is using the inconsistent Hypnosis, so Venomoth definitely has a chance to shine. It's running the exact same set, and it has a lot of the same problems, but it's doing its best. Last up, we've got far and away the best bug type in Generation 1, and that's Pinsir. Pinsir is unique among all 6 fully evolved bug types, because even though it's nothing amazing in never used or underused, it's the only bug type with a niche in overused. And it's a really cool niche. I really enjoy using Pinsir. Pinsir's claim to fame is Swords Dance, and Swords Dance in Generation 1 overused is interesting. It's a valid strategy, but it is undeniably niche, because if you want to use a Swords Dance sweeper, you do have to dip into the lower tiers. The only Pokemon in Overuse that learns Swords Dance is Victreebel, and it can't really afford to run the move. It needs Sleep Powder, Wrap, and Razor Leaf, and having Swords Dance in the 4th slot in that situation isn't that helpful, it's only boosting the power of Wrap. And besides, I could be wrong, but I have a feeling Victreebel's days in Overused are maybe kinda numbered. It's not that great. Victreebel and Lapras are kind of like unofficial borderline Pokemon. So if you want to run Swords Dance in Overused, you've typically got 4 options. Sandslash, Kingler, Kabutops, and Pinsir. All 4 of these Pokemon have their own ups and downs that, make them better in certain situations than others. For example, Sandslash has a unique typing in Pure Ground, which is nice because it gives you an electric immunity and therefore an immunity to Thunder Wave. None of the Swords Dance Sweepers in Overused are that fast, so they really appreciate the opponent's team being paralyzed and hate getting paralyzed themselves, so this is great. However, on the flip side, it's the weakest and slowest out of the 4 Pokemon. Kabutops gets some nice switching opportunities thanks to its normal resistance, and it also has access to Surf to beat the likes of Rhydon and Golem. However, again, it's not that strong, so it misses out on some key KOs, and it's got a lot of very exploitable weaknesses. Kingler is maybe the most popular Swords Dance user. It has access to Crab Hammer, which not only allows you to beat Rhydon and Golem, but it always crits, which allows you to get past stuff like Reflect Snorlax. It's also the strongest of the 4 Pokemon, having a massive 130 attack stat, which means it can secure some KOs that the others miss out on. However, it's still missing out on some important stuff. It's only got a 30% chance to kill the likes of Starmie with a +2 Hyper Beam, which is really unfortunate. Sometimes that's worth the gamble, but, you'd love if it was consistent. It really appreciates the opponent's team being paralyzed and also receiving a bit of prior chip damage. Also, it has terrible special bulk, which is unfortunate considering some of the Pokemon it struggles to beat a bit. Now, if you're going off the viability rankings, then out of these 4 Pokemon, Pinsir is actually ranked the lowest. The other 3 are in D+ rank, and Pinsir is hanging out in D rank, which is kind of weird considering it's the undisputed best mon in the tier. Like I don't know how that happened. There's a couple things that set Pinsir apart from the other Swords Dances in Overused. I think the most obvious one is the typing. Pure Bug. In Overused, that's quite nice. You don't get any stab on anything, which is unfortunate. Pinsir only learns normal and fighting attacks. However, you've got manageable weaknesses, and you've got that nice ground resistance. That's quite good. Pinsir also has access to Submission, which is really nice in a couple scenarios. The recoil sucks, and the accuracy isn't great, but there's a few situations where that little bit of extra damage versus a normal type can really help. It's got some other tools too. You can use Slash for good damage when you don't have a Swords Dance up, or you can use Body Slam to try and spread your own paralysis, but my favourite thing about Pinsir is Bind. Bind is a very yucky move. It's the same vein as Wrap and Fire Spin and, all the trapping moves. If you hit your opponent with it, and you're faster than them, and you don't miss, you can just loop it, and they'll keep taking chip damage, and then, when they're at the right range, you can finish them off with a Hyper Beam or a Submission. An issue a lot of the Swords Dance users in Overused have is that they just miss out on some key KOs, even at +2. For example, at +2, Pinsir's Hyper Beam will do a maximum of 86.6% to Tauros, which isn't bad, but it's not ideal. However, thanks to Bind, you can slowly whittle away a paralyzed Tauros into that ideal range, which is amazing. Each rep of Bind at +2 can do up to 9%, so you really don't have to rely on it too much to get Tauros into that ideal range. I love this, and it's by a mile my favourite thing about Pinsir. Now, Bind, of course, isn't a perfect strategy. It's actually less accurate than Wrap. It's got an accuracy of 75, and without the +2, the damage is meh. It's a little bit inconsistent, but if you're down for using a Pokemon like Pinsir in Overused, you love a little bit of inconsistency. Pinsir is a high-risk, high-reward Pokemon, and I fucking love it. I don't think the Bug type in Generation 1 deserves the terrible reputation it has. It's trying its best. It's nothing amazing, there's no denying that, but I don't think the typing is the main problem with a lot of these Pokemon. The typing itself is solid, but again, it's a victim of circumstance. The Bug type was cursed with terrible move pools, Pokemon with very low base stats, terrible access to the moves that it actually has. The Bug type is simply trying its best, and it's really cool to me that one of them managed to make it work to some degree and put some work in Overused, despite everything. That's really fucking cool. Good job, Pinsir. Go give Pinsir a shot, or some of the other mons in the lower tiers. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised.